ancientfaith.com.
This is Ancient Faith Today with Father Tom Soroka, a weekly live call-in show addressing the issues of our day from a distinctly Orthodox perspective. You can join the conversation by calling in at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Father Tom is the priest at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and welcomes guests from across the globe to discuss important topics of interest. Here's Father Tom.
Welcome to Ancient Faith Today. This is Father Tom Soroka, and I'm so glad that you're with us. We'll be taking your calls in a bit at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. John Maddox himself will be answering your calls tonight, so please make sure to turn the show volume off before you come on air. Now, if you want to participate online, you can go to the AFM Facebook page. Do that now at facebook.com/Ancient Faith Ministries and place a question there in the thread for tonight's show where it's now being live simulcast. You can send us an email at aft@ancientfaith.com, and you can text us. If you'd like to send a question or a comment to us instantly right from your phone, send us a text message to 412-206-5012. Again, our SMS text number is 412-206-5012. So let's get started. Tonight, we're going to talk about sacrifice. I know it seems like maybe an odd topic, but actually, the word sacrifice appears over 200 times in the scriptures. And yet somehow, as a concept, it's quite removed from us modern people. We think of the term sacrifice today as something that we give up. We sacrifice meat and dairy during our fasting periods. Maybe a martyr sacrifices themselves. And when we think about the old sense of sacrifice, we think of some type of ritual, a kind of barbaric ritual slaughter of animals used to appease an angry God. So that brings up a lot of questions about the idea of sacrifice. Why are there so many references to sacrifice in the Bible? Why does God even need, or why does he want a sacrifice to begin with? And that brings us to the topic of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Why did Christ have to die? Did God actually demand a bloody, violent sacrifice of his son in order to be appeased? And what about today? Sometimes we call the Eucharist a sacrifice, an unbloody sacrifice. So what's the meaning of sacrifice for us as Christians? To discuss those questions and more, we are welcoming tonight Father Jeremy Davis. He's the author of a new book called Welcoming Gifts, Sacrifice in the Bible and Christian Life, published by Ancient Faith Publishing. Archimandrite Jeremy assists Metropolitan Joseph at the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese headquarters in Englewood, New Jersey, and he previously served for 15 years at St. Elijah and Holy Ascension Orthodox churches in Oklahoma. He holds an MDiv from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. Father Jeremy, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be with you, Father Thomas.
I'm glad to be with you too. I'll tell you what, this book, I have to tell you, it's a kind of unassuming book because you look at it and you think, I don't know, maybe that's something I'm not really interested in. And you start reading and it brings you in to these topics that are just replete throughout the entire Old Testament and the New Testament. And you do such a masterful job of kind of building the knowledge and helping us understand the role of sacrifice, both in the scriptures and in our life. So I really want to thank you for writing this book, because I'm thinking now, this is the perfect book for like an adult study, that we could go through this and understand this even more. So thank you so much for writing this book. I'm really looking forward to our talk tonight. So I want our listeners to get to know you a little bit more. And I was reading your biography, and you did not start out as an Orthodox Christian. I believe that you were an evangelical. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep.
So tell us about
church.
your background. Yeah, tell us about your background and how you came to the Orthodox faith.
Sure. Well, my family were churchgoers and very active and involved, and so I grew up in evangelical Protestant tradition and came to know the Lord through that. And I appreciate everything that I, gained from that upbringing.
Indeed.
But when I went to college, I was exposed to kind of the breadth of Christianity. Like I'd never, looked into other traditions, Christian traditions. And in doing so, I started studying the history of the church and kind of the church fathers and all of that depth and beauty I really felt was lacking in my experience of the faith. And so I searched, didn't know anything about Orthodoxy. I looked into the Catholic Church until someone, actually a professor of mine, suggested that I visit the Orthodox Church, and I did, and
Wow.
just fell in love at first sight.
That's
my
amazing.
final year of college. Mm-hmm.
That is amazing. And this must have been something very, very different for you. How did you connect to the Orthodox faith? What was it that really spoke to you and drew you in?
Well, everything. But if I was to choose, something, I have always loved history. And it's funny that growing up evangelical Protestant, there was no sense of history, really. There's this huge gap between, biblical times and today. And somehow, even though I loved reading about history sort of in my secular side of my brain, it never occurred to me, like, there's church history too. So being introduced to that was just such a grounding experience, like, wow, being connected all the way back through a living tradition. So that was
Indeed.
Really important. But honestly, you say it was different. There was a lot of things that were different on the outside, but there was also this sense of a clarity of focus, like learning Orthodoxy and just having all of these moments of, wow, that's what I've always actually believed. That's always like the intuitive sense of Christianity I had, but I didn't have the words to articulate that. And it wasn't sort of like formally articulated, but it just felt so familiar when I, came across it in Orthodoxy.
That seems to be the irony of Orthodoxy. It's a kind of paradoxical thing, because I have heard that so many times in people that have come into the church and people that we've talked to on the show and so forth, that they say that this is what I was always looking for, and I just didn't know that it existed. And I was, wondering, where did this church go? And it was here. And it's really a wonderful thing. So thanks for sharing that. So let's talk about sacrifice. First of all, why did you write this book? What is it about this topic that you felt was really important? And specifically, why is the topic of sacrifice important for Orthodox Christians? Because isn't it just something that we forgot about a long time ago, and it happened a long time ago? It doesn't really matter. Christ died, so we don't need to worry about sacrifice anymore. So why is your book important?
Wow. Okay. So start out with why I wrote it, which is actually a very personal kind of experience. So growing up evangelical Protestant, we had a certain idea of salvation, which is called substitutionary atonement or penal substitution atonement, which is the idea that Christ, through his sacrifice on the cross, he died in order to pay the penalty for our sins. And this idea of Christ's sacrifice was sort of projected back onto Old Testament sacrifice, that So the explanation that we would hear was that these animals, were killed by the worshipers so that they could take the death that was due to the worshiper for his sin. So basically, there was just really scapegoating onto onto the animal. The animal would pay the price for the person's sin. And as strangely as that sounds to me now, that's kind of what we grew up with, and I just took that for granted. When I became Orthodox and learning Orthodox theology, that theory of atonement felt very foreign, and I realized very quickly that that's not really how we think about salvation. But had no idea of Old Testament sacrifices, what this means for them. And then what really moved me to look into this was reading the Old Testament from start to finish. It's funny that I had to become Orthodox in order to read the Old Testament straight through for the first time. I didn't do that as a Protestant. I did that as an Orthodox. And when I did that, I was reading all these descriptions of sacrifice, and the idea of atonement that I grew up with, and specifically of sacrifice, did not fit those descriptions at all. I was like, wow, people are eating sacrifices. Like, what does that even mean? And people are like, God's telling people, sacrifice a handful of flour and that will give atonement. Well, nothing got killed. Like, what? There's no blood. This can't be true. Like, what's going on? And so that was actually, that was probably, like 15 years ago, and that it just was like sit in my brain, just like, how am I going to make sense of this? Until finally I said, I'm going to start doing some reading. So I just started reading, whatever I could find, like anthropology, sociology, biblical studies, history, to kind of like, what are scholars telling us about what sacrifice meant, not just in the Bible, but in the ancient world, and just discovered a totally different world that made a lot more sense of what I was reading in the Bible. And then the second part of your question, like, why is this important for us today? Well, you kind of hinted at it, in your introduction. You said, like, the word sacrifice appears 200 times in the Bible. And really, when you look at the Old Testament religion commanded by God was built on sacrifices. Like, I think there's a verse in the Psalms that says, talks about, those who have established his covenant on sacrifices. And the covenant was established on sacrifices, and it revolved around sacrifices. Then you come to Christ, and Christ's death on the cross and our salvation through it is described as a sacrifice, in the scriptures by the church fathers. That's a steady stream of our tradition. And then not only that, but we're told in the New Testament that we're supposed to keep sacrificing. And all of these things that we're supposed to be doing are described as sacrifices. So if we don't understand what this is, if we have a wrong idea of what sacrifice is, it can throw off our whole understanding of the faith and leave us really lost and confused.
Well, that's helpful. That helps kind of frame where we're going to go with this. So maybe build the case so that we don't misunderstand what sacrifice is. Let's start with, as I said, my understanding of sacrifice is, okay, when we're fasting, I am giving up something, or I sacrificed my day for my kids, or whatever it was. Let's go back to even pagan times, and let's go back to the Hebrew world, the Jewish understanding of sacrifice. Help lay that out for us. What then does sacrifice mean, and how was it accomplished?
So, so the primary word used for sacrifices in the Old Testament, even though the word sacrifice occurs a lot, they're most usually called gifts, which is, it's right there in front of us when we read the Old Testament, but somehow that word just doesn't sink in. It's like, these are just sacrifices, but no, they're gifts. They're gifts to God. And so when we look at the ancient world, we see that gifts had a really formal and systematized place in relationships in the ancient world. I mean, even to a greater extent than we see today. We still see echoes of this, but in the ancient world, relationships were built on gift exchange, what anthropologists call friend-making gifts. And so these gifts were symbolic, and they represented pledges. So you would give a gift, and that gift, it wouldn't just be of material value, but it would represent the kind of feelings that you want to express to that other person. And it's also a pledge that, look, I want to start a friendship with you. And then if that person wanted to accept that relationship, they would accept the gift. Now, it would be a big insult, but if they already had enough friends, they'd say, no, thanks, you can keep your gift. And that was really basically like, I just don't have any time for you. So that's how important the gifts were. They had to be given in order to represent the desire for a relationship. They had to be received in order to represent the acceptance of the relationship. And then they would be reciprocated, meaning that at some future time, the other party, your new friend, would give you a gift to sort of represent, I want to keep this relationship going. And then you would give another gift in the future. And there would just be a cycle that would continue and reinforce the relationship through these gifts, which didn't have just material value, but most importantly, they had some kind of symbolic value, representing the gift of yourself to the other person. So we can kind of see that today. I don't know if this image is familiar to people, but like when our president goes to visit just on like a diplomatic visit to another country, then there'll usually be some kind of gift exchange. And the gifts will usually like represent the country. So he goes to Africa and there'll be some like, African tribal mask or something that's given to the president. This represents our country and our culture. And we want you to take this with you because we want a piece of us to be with you and to establish that relationship. And likewise, our president would give them some gift representing the American people. And so really this culture of friend-making gift exchange, sacrifice was the translation of that logic onto the human-divine relationship. And really it is that idea of giving a gift to God through sacrifice. And generally speaking, what that meant was that gift would be burnt on an altar and the smoke would go up to heaven where God is, right? Symbolically speaking. So that idea is shared like throughout the ancient world as far back as historical records go, which points to this being just like a fundamental, primordial human practice and idea. So it's a way to offer a gift to God that represents an invitation to fellowship. And the other way of seeing it kind of complementarily is as food hospitality, which is another kind of, welcoming gift, another kind of friend-making gift.
Okay. So that's helpful, but I want to kind of step back a little bit. I don't want to get too kind of, academic into this, but again, the relationship between these welcoming gifts and sacrifice is what? In other words, are you saying that in ancient cultures, in order to establish a relationship, I'm trying to say it back to you because I want to understand this. So in ancient cultures, in order to establish a relationship between two parties, two people, whatever, gifts would be exchanged as a sign of this relationship or this friendship. And this practice is the basis of offering sacrifices in a ritualistic sense. In other words, in the ancient Near East, in pagan worlds, and of course in the Jewish world, this idea of exchanging gifts or giving gifts is expressed through the idea of sacrifice. Do I have it right?
Yes, you have it right. So this is, when we look at what the church fathers have to say about the origin of sacrifice, St. John Chrysostom, St. Cyril of Alexandria, they look at the sacrifices of Cain and Abel, the second generation of human beings made sacrifices, after leaving the Garden of Eden, after Adam and Eve had left the Garden of Eden. And they look back at that and they say, this is something that human beings have been doing since the very beginning. This is something that God has planted in our souls. He gave us this idea that we can relate to him and we can express to him our love and our desire to have him in our life by giving these kind of relationally significant gifts. And so it's a blessing for us, because obviously God doesn't need the gifts. He has no practical need for our gifts, but he has graciously given us this really earthy way that we can relate to him. It bridges the gap of the transcendent God. And that's like a gift that he's given us, that we can sort of express to him these feelings through things that really don't matter to him, naturally speaking, but they have a significance for us.
Yeah, so I do want to go into the sort of the Christian aspect of it in a little bit, but I kind of want to set this up a little bit more. Just for myself, I'm being totally selfish here. Let's remind our listeners, you can give us a call if you'd like to ask Father Jeremy a question. If you have questions or comments about the idea of offering gifts or sacrifice, give us a call at 1-855-AF-RADIO. We'd love to hear from you. And if you've read Father Jeremy's book, Welcoming Gifts, we would love to hear from you. Give us an endorsement. Also, you can send us a text at 412-206-5012. All right, Father Jeremy, so you kind of set this up. Now, if you could paint us a picture of what this looked like in Judaism, because we can read about it, and you don't really get, when you read about the sacrifices, it's just a kind of matter-of-fact thing, right? It just says, and offer this sacrifice or bring this sacrifice, but it doesn't say how it was done. So I do want to talk about two things here. Tell us why this is at the heart of the Jewish religious observance, specifically this idea of a bloodshed, right? So when we think of sacrifice, even though you're clearly telling us sacrifice can be many things, it can be food, it can be a gift, it can be animals, but we seem to constantly think about the shedding of the blood of animals, obviously because of this maybe Western understanding of atonement and so forth. So can you step us through whatever type of sacrifice happened in Judaism, both in the tent, in the wilderness, and then in the temple? How were these sacrifices, both of animals and of food, accomplished? What actually happened?
Yeah, so and you have to piece together. That's you mentioned, like it's hard to get a sense of it from the scriptures, because you do have to piece together instructions and descriptions that are found in different places. Like it doesn't seem like nobody sat down in writing Leviticus and said, like, in 3,000 years, people are really going to need some help understanding what this is, because in a sense,
they just knew.
They knew because it was already going on.
Right.
Like Leviticus didn't invent sacrifice. What it did was,
that's a good point.
It clarified, and it restricted it, and it said, like, there's all kinds of crazy sacrifice stuff going on in this world. You're not going to do all the crazy stuff. This is how you're going to do sacrifice. But they didn't have to sort of start from scratch.
Well, even I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it kind of brought to remembrance, in your book, you talk about the pressing of a bird against the altar.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I've never heard of that before. Like, it just seems like such an odd thing that they're pushing these birds up again, and that it's, dripping out blood. I mean,
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, because I find that very fascinating.
Yes. Well, so, I mean, it's hard to describe. So you want me to specifically talk about the birds, or talk about like?
Well, no, I mean, like, if they're sacrificing a goat, what does that actually mean? Where would they get the goat? Where would they take the goat? Who would kill the goat? What would they do with the goat? Like, was it burnt? Did they eat it? What, kind of walk us through one of these.
Step by step for a goat. Okay. For a goat.
No, seriously.
So first, whoever was going to offer the sacrifice had to identify the animal. And, not just any animal would do. It had to meet certain criteria. It had to be physically unblemished, basically, not having any kind of defect. And they were minutely examined. First of all, the person who's going to offer it had to like just carefully examine like everything, even such a thing as, I mean, for most sacrifices, if one leg of the animal was longer than the other, it couldn't be offered as a sacrifice. So they had to really.
And is that because you had to give the best to God? Is that because you have to give your best to God?
It's partially because you have to give the best to God, but also because that lack of physical blemish or defect represents a commitment on the offerer's part to have a blameless soul, like an unblemished soul. Yeah, so the physical qualities of the animal actually reflect the pledge or the commitment that the worshiper is making by offering the animal. And we learned that from Philo of Alexandria. So there's some quotes in the book. But so the animal had to be identified, carefully selected, and then brought to the temple. And I should say also that the animal had to be properly owned by the individual. It could not have been a stolen animal, or it couldn't even have been received as a gift. They had to actually make an investment into the animal, either by raising it themselves or buying it. So it had to represent a personal investment. It was brought to the tabernacle or the temple. The temple was later. The tabernacle was kind of the mobile temple. And then when they settled down in Canaan, they built the temple in Jerusalem. And it was presented there before the Lord. And this term before the Lord means, before his home, which was the tabernacle or the temple. And his presence was there. And so they presented their gift there to the Lord. They were probably, sort of like met by a priest, or at least a Levite who sort of helped them with the initial stages, presenting the animal before the Lord. Actually, a step before that, we learned from Philo, not from the scriptures, but from Philo, that the animal was inspected by a priest before it could be presented before the Lord. And actually wasn't just any priest, but like the most experienced and wisest priest would, because it was so important that it not have any defects. So it would be carefully inspected from, tip of the head to the feet.
Okay.
Then presented before the Lord. And then and this was important, the offerer would press his hand onto the head of the animal. And like we talk about, sometimes you read in translations lay his hand on it, but there are different words in Hebrew between laying a hand on the head or pressing the head. Like the other word for laying a hand on the head was used whenever a person was blessed. So like when one of the patriarchs blessed his son, he would lay his hand, just like softly lay his hand on the head. But when an animal was sacrificed, it's a different word, which means that he actually like pressed the head down, which represented like, I'm the master of this animal. I'm the owner. It therefore represents me. This is my animal and it represents me. Yeah. And then after that, the animal's throat would be split. This makes us uncomfortable. But let's remember,
Sure.
when you are going to have steaks for your barbecue, some animal, somebody slit an animal's throat to get that.
Right.
That has to happen.
We've sanitized the process, right?
Yeah, we do. So the throat was slit, and that particular way of killing the animal was important because all of the blood had to be collected. And so the blood was significant. We get grossed out by it, but maybe I can talk a little bit later about the significance of the blood.
I'd love that.
All the blood has to be collected in a bowl. So there would probably be a priest there with a bowl to collect the blood because the priests handled the blood. It was very significant. Once the blood was drained, the animal was then skinned and cut into pieces, like butchering, like a butcher cuts, an animal into like quarters or different pieces of meat. And so the animal had to be cut into pieces of meat, skinned and cut into pieces of meat. And then depending on the kind of offering it was, either part or all of the meat would then be taken to the altar by the priest. But first, before the meat was taken to the altar, the blood was taken to the altar, and it was applied to the altar in a certain way. Now, usually, and that depended on the kind of sacrifice, but usually the priest would walk around the altar, which was huge. I mean, it had a ramp leading up to the top. It was probably 4 feet tall or something like that. So he'd walk around it and splash the blood onto the sides of the altar all the way around in a circle. After he did that, then the same priest or a different priest, but it had to be a priest, would take the portions of meat that were to be burned on the altar, again, depending on the kind of offering, and take them up on the altar and then set them on the fire that was burning there. And it's actually really interesting.
Okay.
The fire, it wasn't that they just lit a fire, but that fire was lit by God when the temple and the tabernacle, actually it happened twice. When the tabernacle was consecrated and then later when the temple was consecrated, both times a heavenly fire came down and lit the fire on the altar.
Wow.
And and then the priests were responsible for continuously keeping that fire lit. So it was the same fire, the same divine fire.
So it's like from God himself consuming the offering.
Yes, precisely. That fire was like God's presence, and actually God's presence is often described as fire in the scriptures. Right. And so now then, depending on the offering, if all of the meat wasn't burned on the altar, then either, like in a sin offering, the priests would eat the rest of the meat. They'd cook it and eat it, for food. Then but if it was a peace offering, which was a kind of like celebratory sacrifice, like thanking God for his blessings,
sure.
You would actually, the offerer who gave it would receive most of the meat back to himself, along with a portion, other foods that he offered, like breads and cakes and wine. Like most of that, like some of it would be offered to God on the altar, then most of it would be returned to him, and then he would have a party, but like a holy party. You had to, who came to it had to be like spiritually prepared so that they were in a fit state to worship God according to the Old Testament laws. And so they ate this meal, which symbolically included God, because he received some of the food, and included the priest who received some of the food, and then included the worshipers. So all together they were sharing this banquet in celebration of amazing. God's goodness. Yeah.
That's really amazing. Yeah, this is fascinating because it really is going to set us up for the second part of the program. We're going to take a short break, Father Jeremy, and we're going to talk about the Christian aspect now. So I want to get to that question about why is blood so important? Life is in the blood, etc. the relationship between sacrifice and food, Christ fulfilling the sacrifices. But I also want to talk about this idea of offering these physical things, right? Because, you being a former Protestant, I think this is a very foreign concept, right? You don't offer bread, or you don't offer cakes, or you don't offer, like we have now, koliva and things that we offer. And this is a very foreign thing. So let's talk about that after we come back from a break. You are listening to Ancient Faith Today. We're talking with Father Jeremy Davis about sacrifice. This is a very, very cool discussion, and I hope that you'll join us. Call us at 1-855-AF-RADIO. Send us a text at 412-206-5012. We will be right back.
Father Tom will be back in a moment. In the meantime, the lines are open at 855-237-2346. Don't go away.
Hi there. I'm Bobby Maddox, station manager of Ancient Faith Radio, and I would like to invite you to the 2022 Ancient Faith Content Creator Conference, which will be held at Antiochian Village from September 19th through the 22nd. The Ancient Faith Content Creator Conference is an outstanding professional development opportunity for creators of Orthodox Christian books and media. I am, of course, in charge of the radio and podcasting track, and I am pleased to announce that Ancient Faith Radio has 4 sessions devoted exclusively to the art and production of effective audio recordings, including one by Derek Cummins, an AFR producer, and another by Brian Jarbo, an engineer at National Public Radio. I myself will conduct introductions to the podcast process, as well as to the genre of podcasting. Be prepared to learn a lot and leave the conference motivated and energized. Hope to see you there. Register at store.ancientfaith.com/content-creator-conference-2022. That's store.ancientfaith.com/content-creator-conference-2022.
We're back with Ancient Faith Today and Father Tom Soroka. Give us a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Father Tom.
Welcome back. We're talking with Father Jeremy Davis about his book, Welcoming Gifts, and we're talking about sacrifice. So, Father Jeremy, you had mentioned about the blood, and you wanted to talk a little bit about why blood is sort of an aspect of some, not all, of the sacrifices in the Old Testament. And so, why does the scripture say, like it says, life is in the blood, and then we're offering this blood, and they're putting the blood up on the altar? What's going on there?
Yeah, so that quote is from Leviticus 17:11, and it says the life. Actually, in Greek, it's the soul. Or actually, in Greek and Hebrew, it's kind of hard to translate that word, life, soul. I kind of like to say life force, because that's kind of the meaning of the Greek psyche. So the soul or life of all flesh is its blood, and I myself have given it to you to make atonement upon the altar for your souls, for its blood makes atonement in place of the soul. That's what God said about the offering of blood in sacrifices. And so God actually, he says that that's the purpose of the animal blood. That's the reason why we have animal blood, is so that it can be offered on the altar. I mean, it's like, and as a result, and animal blood could not be used for any other purpose by Jews. God actually commanded that no one could consume blood. There are other cultures where, actually, some cultures where blood is drunk. That sounds kind of gross to us, but there are other cultures where like blood is made into like blood pudding or things like that, like cooked. But according to the Old Testament law, it could not be consumed. Blood could not be consumed because it has this very special purpose. And what God means, at least as I understand it, what God means by the life of the animal is in the blood, that this is really, it's a very earthy concept that we can observe. Like, right, if a blood has its animal, if an animal has its blood in it, it's alive, right? If the blood comes out of the animal, it's not alive anymore. And the blood has to keep circulating in the animal in order for it to be alive. So somehow the blood represents symbolically, and in a sense, even beyond the symbolic, like it is what's keeping the animal alive.
Sure.
And so the blood, like, is imprinted with all of the qualities of the animal's life.
Wow.
Which is what makes it significant, because, you know, like I said, that sacrifices were symbolic gifts to God, and I already mentioned how, like, they had to be unblemished, but they also, you know, these specific species of animals, they represent obedience, because they're domesticated, tame animals. They represent harmlessness, because they are all herbivores. None of them are carnivores. They represent also, like, beneficence, I call it, or like helpfulness towards human needs, like they provide things that human beings need. And so all of these qualities of their life are kind of symbolically imprinted on their blood, and that makes the blood from these particular animals so meaningful.
Fascinating. And in terms of, you had just mentioned here, because I want to talk a little bit about the idea of sacrifice and food. In other words, you know, you said that in the peace offering, they could consume the meat, or they make a cake and then they have this party. So you had said, but, you know, the one thing that could never be consumed was blood, that it was forbidden. I assume this must be why they were so horrified when Jesus said, that you will drink of his blood and eat his flesh. Yes?
Yes, yes. And so think about it, like, if the blood represents all the qualities of the animal life, then for a human being to drink that blood means to take on an animal-type life. And even though these animals represent good things, it's like we're called to something higher. We're created in the image of God, not to be like animals.
Right.
And there were actually other cultures, there have been other cultures throughout history where people would intentionally drink the blood of, like, you drink the blood of a bear, so I'll be as strong as a bear, you know what I mean? Or I'll drink the blood of a ox so that I can be as strong as an ox, or whatever, you know, like,
sure. Right.
But Jews were not to do that, because, like, we have a higher, and all human beings were actually, God commanded not to do it, not just Jews. But because we have a higher calling, but here's the thing: to drink Christ's blood is the only kind of blood it makes sense to drink, because he has that divine life that in him that we are called to. So that is the blood that we need to take into ourselves so that we can become like him.
Fascinating. I love this. This is amazing. 1-855-AF Radio would love to hear from you, or send us a text if you have any questions. So, Father, you have this idea of, in the Old Testament, breads and grains and cakes and animals, of course. So what is this relationship then between sacrifice and food? And let's kind of tie the bow on this in terms of Christ, his sacrifice, and then how we as Christians, what would you say, take this life into us? Is that really is that the whole idea here? That when we are drinking the blood of Christ in the Eucharist and eating his body, we are, as you said, taking that life into us. Is that really what's happening here?
Yeah. So, but to take it a step back, because obviously that's what we usually think of in terms of the divine liturgy, is taking Christ into ourselves. But what we miss, because we don't understand sacrifice correctly, is that, like, it's not just about us receiving. It's the first part is us giving to God.
Yes.
And so in Old Testament sacrifice, the blood was given to God. It was splashed on the altar as kind of like that symbolic pledge that I, the offerer, am going to live in a spiritual way that reflects the physical qualities of this animal. So that purity or blamelessness, unblemishedness, also that obedience, that harmlessness, that beneficence that the animal represents, that I am going to live that way towards God. So the blood was offered to God in that sense. And then also part or all of the animal meat was offered to him as a meal. Again, symbolic with all of those qualities, but a meal of hospitality offered to God. And of course, food is how we show love, right? It's how we show welcome. Right. It's how we invite someone to be with us. And the more important the guest, the bigger the spread and the more love and care goes into it. So it's all of those kind of things acted out towards God. And likewise, when we come to the divine liturgy, like before we receive communion, we are offering the body and blood of Christ to God. And we're offering it to him. Thine own of thine own we offer unto thee. We're offering it to him as a sign that we want him to join us in this meal that we are about to receive. That we want to welcome him into our lives with this food, which is not just food, but this food that represents now all of the qualities of Christ. Whereas the animals, they just sort of had physical qualities that reminded us of these spiritual qualities. Christ himself is morally perfect and pure, right? He is perfectly obedient to the Father. He is perfectly harmless in the sense that, there's no dangerous bone in his body. He's perfectly beneficial or beneficent towards his fellow man. He, loves to the bitter end. So all those qualities we're offering to God and saying, we are pledging ourselves to strive to be like Christ, to be like this offering that we're giving you. Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to, though, I ask you, because you said we're offering the body and blood of Christ. I want to understand this fully. So are we not offering bread and wine, though, to God himself? Are we offering the bread and the wine to God?
Mm-hmm. We are offering the bread and the wine to God, but here's the thing. We, obviously it's after thine own of thine own that the epiclesis happens and that the bread and the wine become the true body and blood of Christ. However, even before that, they are humanly prepared symbols of the bread of the body and blood of Christ. So they aren't yet the real thing before the Holy Spirit descends upon them. But in the proscomedia service, the priest, prepares them with words that symbolically designate these. This is now the Lamb that is crucified. I mean, we literally, the deacon says literally, crucify, Master. You know what I mean? And we crucify this piece of bread, and we pierce, Master, just like Christ was pierced. We pierce it, and then we pour blood into, or we pour the wine and water into the chalice, and while we're quoting from the gospel, and so we intentionally designate this bread and this wine prepared as a symbol of Christ, as symbols of Christ, and that's what we offer to him is the symbols that we've prepared.
Do you see because as you're explaining this, I'm thinking back to what you said before about the preparation of the animals in the Old Testament, right? So they had to put their hand on it, and they had to, kill it, and they had to cut it in pieces, and then they had to take it to the altar, and then, the people got to take some home or whatever, or the priests. Is the parallel then the Christian understanding of sacrifice, this kind of ritual? Would you say that this is a kind of parallel to that, where the bread and the wine is made by the people, and then it's brought to the church, and then it's blessed, and it's cut, and it's offered, and then it's on an altar, and then it's given back to the people. Is that really sort of the parallel here?
Oh, exactly. Yeah. So that's chapter 14 of the book. It walks us through step by step through that offering of the Eucharist, and how it really Christianizes the whole procedure of Old Testament of sacrifice. Yeah.
It's amazing because I was just telling our Bible study, we're going through Hebrews right now, and I was telling them last week, when I was a music teacher, this is like 30 years ago, I had a Jewish girl in my class, and she invited me to her bat mitzvah, and I thought, oh, well, I'll go. I've never been to a Jewish service before. I was shocked at how similar the service was, especially at one point they brought the Torah around the synagogue, and people came up and touched it and kissed their hand and, touched the Torah, and it was processed around and so forth. And I thought, wow, this is where this all comes from. And so what you're saying is, in the Divine Liturgy, this is where this all comes from. It's just the fulfillment of the Christian fulfillment of this Old Testament sacrificial system. Yes?
Yes. Yeah, precisely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here's my question, though. And this, you're the perfect person to answer this, because, a Protestant will often say, look, why are you doing this? God did away with the sacrificial system. He is the sacrifice. We don't offer sacrifices anymore. The temple curtain has been torn, right? And so therefore we don't need to do all of this. Why are you making these offerings to God? You're not a Jew. This isn't the Old Testament. You should simply offer a sacrifice of praise to God. Why are you perpetuating this kind of ritualistic sacrificial system, which is like following the old law? So how would you answer that?
It's very interesting. So actually, Jesus never says don't offer sacrifice. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, he assumes that we'll be offering sacrifice. He says, if you are, taking your offering to the altar and you realize that that your brother has something against you, leave your sacrifice at the altar, go be reconciled with your brother, and then come back and offer your sacrifice. So he assumes that we're going to be offering sacrifice. Of course, the Old Testament sacrifices don't make sense anymore because Christ has fulfilled them, but that doesn't mean he's done away with sacrifice. And then, as I mentioned, like in the New Testament, in the epistles, we're called to make several kind of sacrifices. Now, a lot of them Protestants wouldn't disagree with. Like you mentioned, sacrifice of praise. There's giving to others is a sacrifice in Hebrews. Hebrews says, do not neglect to do good and to share, because with such sacrifices God is well pleased. There are others. But specifically, the Eucharist is also a sacrifice, and we see this in 1 Corinthians, I believe. St. Paul compares the Eucharist to Jewish sacrifice and to pagan sacrifice. And he says that, like Jewish sacrifice, the Eucharist is a way of establishing communion with God. And it's unlike pagan sacrifice, which is a way of establishing communion with demons. But basically, they all operate, Christian, Jewish, and pagan sacrifice, all operate on the same logic. The idea that if you make a sacrifice or if you offer a sacrifice to a divine being, then you are establishing communion with that divine being. But the difference is, with pagan sacrifice, Christians can't participate in it because by so doing, they're establishing communion with demons, like with false gods. So
it's amazing. The way that you bring this out and the way that you've presented it in the book, this is really, honestly, I think this is required reading, because I think a lot of people, I'll be perfectly honest, we're both priests, and we've seen, people just go to church and they'll say, well, why do you do that? Why do you people wear robes and offer bread and wine? Say, oh, well, I don't know. That's just what we do. And, oh, well, we don't do that. Protestants will say we have a praise band, and, we raise our hands and we're offering a sacrifice of praise. And that's the real biblical way to do it. But I think, we haven't really made the case. And what you're doing in this book, Father, is you are making the case for our worship. You're saying, this is where it comes from. This is how God has told us to continue to offer sacrifices to Him, in sort of participate in the one sacrifice of Christ, so that we can have this new life in us. So I just really think this is absolutely essential and brilliant, and we need to understand it much better. You've done a wonderful service for us in helping us understand this. So let's kind of tie a bow on this, and let's say, how do Orthodox Christians then participate in sacrifice today? If somebody comes to you and says, okay, well, how do I do this? How are there other ways for me to be sacrificial and to offer sacrifices? How would you answer that?
So, I'll give like a simple overall answer, then specific. So the simple overall answer is to find ways in your life to invite God into relationship with you, like to invite God into your life. And the ways that we're taught in Scripture are, number one, by listening to His commands, or like reading the Scriptures and taking His commands to heart, His desires for us to heart, and like being obedient to them. That's a way of showing God that you want Him in your life. I mean, like, think about, if you have someone, if you have a friend who just completely ignores your wishes all the time, he's not going to be your friend for very long, right? So if we want God in our lives, especially since He is the all-wise, all-powerful Lord of the universe, then we need to pay attention to what He says, and not just pay lip service, but actually like try to live it. And when we do that, that's a sacrifice. It's the living sacrifice of obedience, and it's a way that draws us into closer relationship with God. Another way is sacrificial giving. I mentioned before in Hebrews, it says, do not neglect to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. And the church fathers, St. John Chrysostom has this beautiful homily where he talks about how the poor, the needy, are an altar on which we can offer sacrifice, and that offering, like that, giving our worldly possessions to those in need, giving money, but even beyond just material, like giving our time, giving our love to those who need it, is a way of offering sacrifice to God. And actually, St. John Chrysostom says that it's an even greater sacrifice than the Eucharist, which just blows your mind. Yeah. Right. So that's another way, and really that's in a sense, think about, like, if someone, let's say you're a parent with children, and someone, shows kindness to your children, that makes you happy. It makes you feel closer to that person. You might actually become friends with that person just because they've been so kind to your children. Well, that's how it is with God. Like, we're all God's children, and like Christ says, whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done it for me. If you care for his children with love, that draws him into relationship with you. It knits you together with him. And then you mentioned the sacrifice of praise and prayer, like spending time with God and focused on God. And then think about, again, like, and we're talking about like a daily prayer rule. We're talking about attending church, not just for Sundays, but for feast days, that all this is a way of spending time with God. And again, in relationships, if you have a friend, quote unquote, who's always too busy to spend time with you, he's not going to be your friend for very long.
Right.
But if you want someone in your life, you make the time to just spend with them. And that time doesn't have to be, quote unquote, productive. Like Americans, we're focused on being productive,
Yes, right.
But think about it. On the other hand, what do we do with our friends? We hang out with our friends. Like, there doesn't have to be an agenda. It's just like we're doing something with them that they enjoy and we enjoy being with them. So, all of these relational things are really how sacrifice can play a role in our lives.
Outstanding. Father Jeremy Davis, thank you so much. Way to remind everybody that you can purchase right now Welcoming Gifts, Sacrifice in the Bible and Christian Life by Father Jeremy Davis at store.ancientfaith.com. This is an outstanding book. So much scripture, so much history, so much research, and you just present the whole thing so wonderfully, so accessible and so applicable. Father Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Before I share a few final thoughts, I want to offer my to Father Jeremy Davis for joining us tonight. Thanks also to John Maddox for engineering the program, to our show production assistant, Melissa, for her work behind the scenes, for everybody that listened in, and for those who will be listening. Just to close out, I want to read a quote from the earliest Christian document that we possess. It is as early as some of the scriptures. It's called the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles. And it says this about sacrifice and offering. Assemble on the Lord's Day and break bread and offer the Eucharist, but first make confession of your faults, so that your sacrifice may be a pure one. Anyone who has a difference with his fellows is not to partake with you until he has been reconciled, so as to avoid any profanation of your sacrifice. For this is the offering which the Lord has said, everywhere and always, bring me a sacrifice that is undefiled, for I am a great king, says the Lord, and my name is the wonder of the nations. And that's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday. Share out our program after that's posted. Give us your feedback and contact us with any ideas or topics that you might want to hear about. Join us next Tuesday evening for another edition of Ancient Faith Today. Good night, everybody.
Boldly proclaiming the truth of the risen Christ. This is Ancient Faith Radio, timeless Christianity 24 hours a day.
Hi there. I'm Bobby Maddox, station manager of Ancient Faith Radio, and I would like to invite you to the 2022 Ancient Faith Content Creator Conference, which will be held at Antiochian Village from September 19th through the 22nd. The Ancient Faith Content Creator Conference is an outstanding professional development opportunity for creators of Orthodox Christian books and media. I am, of course, in charge of the radio and podcasting track, and I am pleased to announce that Ancient Faith Radio has 4 sessions devoted exclusively to the art and production of effective audio recordings, including one by Derek Cummins, an AFR producer, and another by Brian Jarbo, an engineer at National Public Radio. I myself will conduct introductions to the podcast process as well as to the genre of podcasting. Be prepared to learn a lot and leave the conference motivated and energized. Hope to see you there. Register at store.ancientfaith.com/content-creator-conference-2022. That's store.ancientfaith.com/content-creator-conference-2022.
Welcome to the Spirit of St. Tikhon's, the Ancient Faith radio broadcast from St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary in South Canaan, Pennsylvania. Founded in 1938, St. Tikhon's Seminary is where saints have walked. 5 of the North American saints sojourned here, including St. Tikhon of Moscow, who founded the monastery and inspired the founding of the seminary, and St. Nikolai of Zhicha, who was the rector here in the 1950s. St. Tikhon's purpose is the spiritual formation and training of the next generation of missionary priests for service in the fields of North America and beyond. The Spirit of St. Tikhon's aims to give you an audible glimpse into the life of the seminary and monastery. We invite you to come and see.
Greetings, everyone. This is Father John Parker, the Dean of St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary in South Canaan, Pennsylvania. We are here in our Ancient Faith studio. I'm sitting with Nico Petrogeorge, who is the Executive Director of the Orthodox Christian Prison Ministry. He's come to visit us at St. Tikhon's in order to talk to the students a little bit about the prison ministry and also to observe the remarkable work, if I may say so, Nico, the remarkable work that we have here at the seminary in conjunction with the state prison just down the road. Nico, good morning.
Good morning, Father. Thank you.
It's a joy to be with you here at St. Tikhon's. Tell us, I know a little bit about the prison ministry because I have a